He ordered one bride from a catalog, but the train that pulled into the station didn't bring one woman. It brought three, and that was just the beginning of his problems. The year was 1886. Out on the Dakota prairie, the silence wasn't empty. It was a physical thing. For Isaac Prescott, it was his only companion. A heavy blanket that pressed down on him from the big bruised sky and rose up from the hard, cracked soil. He was a man drowning in silence. 5 winters ago, he'd buried his wife, Mary, and their baby boy. Grief moved in that day. It sat in her chair. It slept on her side of the bed. It carved his face into a mask of a man who'd given up. He was 34, but his eyes were ancient. He worked himself to the bone, sunrise to sunset, just so he'd be too tired to remember. But you can't outwork a ghost. His farm was his prison. 160 acres of nothing but him and the wind. The house was solid. The barn was sturdy. But it wasn't a home. A home has a future. His house only had a past. Mary's sewing basket still sat by the fireplace, covered in a fine layer of dust. The cradle he'd carved with his own hands sat in the corner of the bedroom, a silent monument to what he'd lost. He was disappearing into himself. The folks in the nearby town of Providence whispered about him. The lonely farmer, the haunted man. Then one day, the town's biggest gossip, a store owner named Walter Henderson, planted a seed. "A man ain't meant to be alone, Isaac," he'd said, his voice slick with phony concern. "This land will eat you alive. You need a wife." Isaac ignored him. For weeks he ignored him, but Henderson kept pushing. Mail-order brides, he'd say. Good women from the East looking for a new life. The idea felt like a betrayal, a stranger in Mary's house. But the loneliness, it was a cold that got into his bones. It was a constant physical ache. So one day, beaten down and tired of the quiet, he listened. Henderson showed him an ad, a clipping from a newspaper, a respectable woman of good character, simple, modest. In a moment of weakness he would curse for the rest of his life. Isaac gave Henderson the money for a reply and for a train ticket. He did it, and then tried to forget it ever happened. He expected nothing to come of it. That was easier. So when a letter arrived weeks later, announcing her arrival, his heart hammered in his chest with a feeling he couldn't name. Panic? Hope? He spent a week cleaning the house like a man possessed. He changed the linens on Mary's bed, his hands shaking. He scrubbed the floors. He even bought a tin of lemon candies, Mary's favorite, and then stared at it, wondering what in God's name he was doing. He told himself it was just practical. He needed help on the farm, that's all. It wasn't a replacement. It was just survival. The day came. He hitched his horse, Pate, to the wagon, and made the long, dusty ride to Providence. He felt like a fool walking to his own hanging. He stood on the platform, his hat pulled low, and watched the train approach like a great black snake. He braced himself for one woman, a single, solitary figure to match his own lonely life. The train hissed to a stop. A salesman got off, a family with loud kids, and then, them. One by one, they came down the steps. Not one. 3. They were sisters, you could see it in their faces. Same dark, curly hair, same guarded look in their eyes. And they were all large, not just sturdy, not just stout. They were immense. Their presence on the narrow platform was overwhelming. Isaac's mind just stopped. He stared. He had prepared for one woman. 3 was a disaster. Then he heard it. A loud, braying laugh from the door of the mercantile. It was Henderson. His face was red, and he was grinning from ear to ear. He caught Isaac's eye and gave him a sick, greasy wink. And the truth hit Isaac like a physical blow. This wasn't a mistake. This was a joke, a cruel public joke. Henderson had sent for 3 of the largest women he could find to humiliate him, and the whole town was watching the punchline. His blood ran cold, then hot with rage. The eldest sister looked at him. There was no begging in her eyes, just a kind of tired dignity, as if she'd spent her whole life being stared at. In that moment, Isaac faced a choice. He could turn around, leave them there to be laughed at, to be shipped back like unwanted cargo, or he could walk toward them. He felt every eye in that town on him. He felt Henderson's triumphant smirk. He thought of his crushing loneliness, his silent, empty house. Then he looked at the three women. He saw their exhaustion, their fear, and the fierce way they stood together, a tiny island against a sea of scorn. He didn't see a joke. He saw himself, an outcast. Slowly, deliberately, Isaac Prescott moved. He walked right past Henderson's sneering face. He ignored the whispers. He stopped a few feet in front of the eldest sister and took off his hat. "I am Isaac Prescott," he said, his voice rusty from not being used. "You've had a long journey. The wagon is this way." He didn't smile. He didn't explain. He just turned and led the way, leaving the laughter to die behind him. For the first time in 5 years, Isaac had made a decision that wasn't about the past. He had no earthly idea what he was doing. But as he helped the first sister onto the wagon bench, her hand surprisingly firm in his, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't have done anything else. The silence in the wagon on the ride back was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the breathing of 4 strangers, tied together by a cruel joke and a future that was anybody's guess. The ride back to the farm was thick with a silence you could cut with a knife. Isaac stared straight ahead, his jaw so tight it ached. Beside him, the oldest sister sat straight as a board. In the back, the other 2 huddled together. The endless prairie surrounded them. For Isaac, it had always been a symbol of his loneliness. Now he wondered what they saw. Did they see an open sky, or just a terrifying, empty cage? Their presence was a weight in the wagon. It was a disruption to the very air. His mind was a storm of problems. 3 of them. Where would they sleep? What would they eat? The ad was a lie spun by Henderson to make him a fool. But what had they been told? What promises had been broken the second they stepped off that train? A fresh wave of hot anger at Henderson washed over him. But anger didn't solve the problem sitting right there in his wagon. When they finally reached the farm, the small house and barn looked like toys against the huge sky. He heard a tiny gasp from the back of the wagon. He couldn't tell if it was relief or disappointment. He pulled the wagon to a stop. The dust settled around them. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the wind. Finally, Isaac turned to the woman beside him. He started, but the words wouldn't come. What could he possibly say? This was all a horrible mistake. You were sent here to make me a laughingstock. The cruelty of it was a bitter taste in his mouth. She saved him the trouble. She turned her head, and he saw her eyes clearly for the first time. They were deep brown and held no illusions. "I am Esther Donovan," she said, her voice low and steady. "These are my sisters, Matilda and Beatrice." Her eyes swept over the farm, taking in its stark, lonely neatness. "The advertisement was for a single bride, Mr. Prescott. We are aware of the discrepancy." Her directness caught him off guard. He'd expected tears or accusations, not this quiet, powerful dignity. "The advertisement was a lie," he managed to say. "A prank." Esther's expression didn't change, but he saw a flicker of resignation in her eyes. It was a look that said she wasn't surprised that cruelty was at the heart of their situation. "I see," she said. Behind her, Matilda, the middle sister with a round, calm face, put a hand on the arm of the youngest, Beatrice, whose eyes were wide with a fear she couldn't hide. "You have no obligation to us," Esther continued, her voice firm as if she'd rehearsed this. "If you will allow us to rest for the night, we can make our own arrangements in the morning." Isaac looked at them. Really looked. 3 women, alone, with almost no belongings, in a town that had already marked them for ridicule. Make their own arrangements? The words were a joke. Where would they go? What would they do? He pictured Henderson's leering face, and the decision he'd made at the train station hardened into steel in his chest. "No," he said. The single word was sharp in the quiet air. He jumped down from the wagon and lowered the tailgate. "You'll stay." He didn't look at them. He focused on their bags. "The house is small, but you'll be safe here." He led them inside. The house smelled of sorrow and dust. It was the smell of his life for the last 5 years. To them, it must have felt like a tomb. He watched their eyes take in the worn furniture, the cold hearth. Their very presence seemed to change the air in the room, filling the emptiness with a nervous, crackling energy. Then came the first problem: sleeping. There was his room, with his and Mary's bed, and there was a small study with a narrow cot. Without a word, he walked into the bedroom and started stripping the quilt off the bed. "What are you doing?" Esther's voice was sharp. "This is your room," he said, not looking at her. He pulled the sheets off, his movements stiff. A faint, ancient scent of lavender rose up, a ghost from another life that stabbed him in the heart. "It's the only bed big enough." "We cannot take your bed, Mr. Prescott," she insisted. "You will," he said, his back to her. "I'll sleep in the study. There's a cot." He gathered the old linens and walked out, brushing past them. It wasn't kindness. It was just practical. But as he dropped the linens in the laundry basket, he knew he'd just surrendered something. He'd let strangers into the most sacred, painful place in his world, and it left him feeling hollowed out, and terrifyingly a little bit lighter. That night, lying on the narrow cot, he stared into the dark. He could hear the soft, alien sound of other people breathing coming from his old bedroom, and he knew with a chilling certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. But he didn't know the real reason they were there. He thought it was a prank. He was wrong. The real story was much, much darker. The days settled into a strange new rhythm. Isaac would wake before dawn, like always, but now he'd walk into the kitchen to find a fire already going and the smell of coffee in the air. Esther was always up first, a silent sentinel in the morning gloom. She'd hand him a tin mug of coffee without a word. It became a ritual, a silent truce. He thought they'd be a burden, 3 helpless women from the city. He couldn't have been more wrong. The Donovan sisters were anything but helpless. They had a toughness that stunned him. They didn't wait to be told what to do. They just saw a problem, and they fixed it. Esther, the oldest, took charge of the house like a general. Within a week, the years of dust were gone. The windows were so clean the light seemed different, brighter. She mended his worn-out work shirts with stitches so fine you could barely see them. She organized the pantry, baked bread that filled the house with a smell he'd long forgotten. A smell of life. She was their anchor. Matilda, the quiet middle sister, had a surprising gift. She wasn't afraid of the hard work outside. She had a strange, calming effect on the animals. His milk cow, which had been ornery for weeks, stood perfectly still for her while she milked it, chewing its cud peacefully. She started working in Mary's old kitchen garden, a patch of earth he hadn't been able to touch for 5 years. She pulled weeds and tilled the soil with a slow, powerful rhythm. Beatrice, the youngest and most timid, had a different kind of strength. She found beauty where Isaac had only ever seen bleakness. She'd come back from walks with handfuls of wildflowers and arrange them in old jam jars, putting them on the table and the mantel. Tiny, defiant splashes of color in his gray world. One evening, he found her on the porch, sketching the sunset on a piece of scrap wood with a piece of charcoal. She tried to hide it, embarrassed, but he saw it. She'd captured the fire and shadow of the prairie sky perfectly. For a second, he saw the land through her eyes, and it didn't look like a prison. Their presence changed everything. He still worked from sunrise to sunset, but he wasn't just working to numb himself anymore. He was working toward the promise of a warm meal, a clean house, the low murmur of voices he wasn't a part of, but was near. The house was no longer a tomb. It was alive. They barely spoke at first, just the essentials. "The well pump is sticking," he'd say. "I'll look at it," Esther would reply. They were like cautious animals, circling each other, learning the territory. The real shift came with a storm. Not a blizzard, but a sudden, violent thunderstorm that turned the sky a sick green-black. The wind howled. Rain came down in blinding sheets. Isaac was in the barn trying to secure a loose patch on the roof when lightning hit a nearby cottonwood tree. The crack was so loud it felt like the world had split in two. His horse, Pate, went crazy, rearing and kicking in his stall. As Isaac was trying to calm him, the barn door flew open. Matilda stood there, soaked to the skin, hair plastered to her face. "The chickens!" she yelled over the storm. "The coop door blew open!" He hadn't even thought about them. They'd scatter and drown. Without another word, they both ran out into the mud and rain. For 20 minutes, they slipped and scrambled, herding the terrified birds back into the coop. It was ridiculous. At one point, Matilda slipped and fell hard into a huge puddle. When Isaac pulled her up, her face was streaked with mud, and she was laughing, a real, deep belly laugh. The sound was so strange, so out of place in his silent world, that it stopped him dead. He stared at her, and he felt the corner of his own mouth twitch into a smile, a rusty, unfamiliar feeling. They finally got the last chicken inside and stood under the overhang of the barn, drenched and breathing hard. "Thank you," he said. Matilda just nodded, her smile softening. "They are good layers," she said, as if that explained everything. Later that night, sitting around the fire, something had broken between them. The shared crisis had washed away some of the awkwardness. For the first time, Isaac volunteered a piece of himself. "My father taught me how to set a roof," he said into the quiet. "He used to say a man's character is like his roof. If it's got holes, everything underneath gets ruined." The sisters looked at him. It was the first time he'd ever talked about his past. Esther put down her sewing. "Our father was a bookseller," she said. "He believed a person's character was a library. The richer the stories you took in, the richer you became." She glanced around the small, rough cabin. "He didn't prepare us for this." "But you learned," Isaac said, looking from one to the other. "You all learned." "We had to," Esther said. And in those 3 words, Isaac heard a whole lifetime of hardship, of being overlooked, of having no one to rely on but each other. He was starting to see past the cruel joke. Their size, which was the first thing he'd noticed, was now the last thing he saw. He saw Esther's fierce, protective strength. He saw Matilda's deep, quiet resilience. He saw Beatrice's fragile, determined search for beauty. These were women of immense substance. The space they took up in his house was nothing compared to the space they were starting to fill in his empty life. He thought he was beginning to understand them, but he still didn't know their secret. He didn't know what they were really running from, and that secret was a ticking clock. The peace on the farm was a fragile thing, an unspoken truce held together by hard work and a growing, grudging respect. But the outside world was still out there, and they were running low on supplies. Isaac knew he had to go back to town. He dreaded it. The thought of Henderson's smirking face, the whispers, the stares, it made his stomach clench. He thought about sending one of the sisters, but the idea felt wrong. He wouldn't subject them to that alone. This was his mess. "I'm going into town," he announced at breakfast. 3 pairs of eyes snapped up to look at him. "We need flour, salt, coffee," he said, trying to make it sound normal. "I'll come with you," Esther said immediately. It wasn't a request. "No," Isaac said too sharply. "I'll go alone." "Mr. Prescott," she said, her voice quiet but hard as iron. "We are not children to be hidden. We will not live in fear of gossips. Whatever they have to say, they can say it to my face." Matilda and Beatrice murmured their agreement. He looked at their determined faces. He'd been trying to protect them, but he realized his protection was just another kind of cage. It was a form of shame. They were right. Hiding would only prove Henderson right. "All right," he said, "but we stay together." The ride into Providence was tense. Isaac sat next to Esther on the wagon bench. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It felt like the quiet between two soldiers before a battle. As they pulled onto the main street, everything stopped. Conversations died. People froze on the wooden sidewalks to stare. It was exactly as he'd feared. He felt Esther stiffen beside him, but she held her chin high. He pulled the wagon to a stop right in front of Henderson's mercantile, the heart of the ambush. "Wait here," he said, his voice low. He swung down from the wagon, his boots hitting the dirt with a solid thud. He felt every eye in town on his back as he walked to the door. The bell jingled. Henderson was behind the counter. He looked up, and a slow, nasty grin spread across his face. "Well, well," he drawled, his eyes flicking to the wagon outside. "Look what the cat dragged in." And he brought the whole litter with him. "Tell me, Prescott, how are you enjoying your family?" The store was empty, but Isaac knew the clerks were listening in the back. This was a show. Isaac walked slowly to the counter. He placed his hands flat on the wood and leaned in, his voice a low whisper that was more dangerous than any shout. "Henderson, you're going to fill my order. You're going to give me a fair price, and you are never going to speak of me or those women again. Not to my face, not behind my back. Do you understand me?" Henderson's grin wavered. He tried to puff out his chest. "Now hold on, Prescott. It was just a little fun. Can't take a joke. A man orders one bride, gets 3 of the biggest sows I've ever seen. It's funny." The rage Isaac had been holding back for weeks finally snapped. He didn't yell. He didn't make a fist. He just reached across the counter, grabbed a handful of Henderson's shirt, and yanked him forward until their noses were almost touching. Henderson's eyes went wide with fear. "Those women," Isaac snarled, his voice a low, gravelly growl, "have more decency and character in their little finger than you have in your entire worthless body. They have turned my house into a home. They have shown me kindness when all you've ever shown is spite. What you call a joke, Mr. Henderson, I'm starting to think is the greatest blessing of my life. So you will keep your filthy mouth shut. If I ever hear you or anyone else in this town speak one disrespectful word about them, I will come back here and we will have a conversation that doesn't involve words." He shoved Henderson back. The man stumbled against a shelf, knocking over a pyramid of canned peaches that crashed to the floor. He was pale, his bravado gone. Isaac slapped his list on the counter. "My order." Shaking, Henderson started gathering the items. Isaac stood there like a statue, a silent guard, until every last thing was packed. When he carried the supplies out, he felt like he'd just won a war. The sisters were watching him, their faces a mix of fear and awe. He had defended them. Publicly. Unconditionally. He had declared them his. As he loaded the last sack, the town pastor, Mr. Hale, walked over. He was a kind old man who had buried Isaac's wife. "Isaac," he said, his eyes troubled as he looked from Isaac to the sisters. "There's talk." "Let them talk," Isaac said. "It's not a respectable situation, Isaac," the pastor said gently. "A man living with 3 unmarried women. It is not right in the eyes of God or the community." Isaac turned to face him. He looked at the pastor, then back at the 3 women in his wagon. He saw their quiet strength, their dignity. The choice was so simple, it was almost funny. "Pastor," Isaac said, his voice softening but firm, "God has been absent from my house for 5 years. These women brought him back. They are my family now. And if the community can't see the decency in that, then it's the community that isn't respectable, not us." He climbed onto the wagon, picked up the reins, and drove down the main street of Providence, not with his head down in shame, but held high. Beside him, Esther Donovan sat just as tall. He had drawn a line in the dirt. It was them against the world. And as the town disappeared behind them, Isaac realized he didn't feel lonely at all. For the first time in a long, long time, he felt like he was finally going home. But he'd just made a powerful enemy. And Henderson wasn't the kind of man to forget a humiliation. He'd get his revenge. And winter was coming. The stand in town had changed them. It wasn't an unspoken arrangement anymore. It was a declaration. They were a family, and they would defend their fortress together. But their new unity was about to face a test far worse than town gossip. The Dakota winter didn't arrive gently. It came with a roar. The clear blue sky turned to the color of a lead plate. The wind started as a low moan and grew into a piercing shriek, carrying the first stinging needles of ice. Isaac knew the signs. He'd seen it before. "Blizzard," he said, the single word cutting through the warmth of the kitchen. "It's going to be a bad one." In an instant, they were a machine. No panic, just grim, focused urgency. Isaac and Matilda raced to the barn, hauling in extra firewood, checking on the livestock, securing every latch. Inside, Esther and Beatrice filled every pot and bucket with water from the pump and stuffed rags into the cracks around the windows. The snow started coming down, thick and blinding, driven sideways by the wind. Within an hour, the world outside was gone, erased. All that existed was a swirling white vortex of chaos. The temperature dropped like a stone. The wind clawed at the little house, rattling it to its bones, seeming to seep right through the walls. They were trapped, a tiny ship of life on a raging, frozen ocean. For 2 days, the storm never stopped. The wind was a constant, deafening scream. Snow piled in monstrous drifts against the doors and windows, plunging the house into a permanent twilight. They kept the fire roaring, their only shield against the deadly cold. The shared danger created a new kind of closeness. Isaac found himself watching them. The way Beatrice's hand trembled slightly as she added a log to the fire. The way Matilda would press her ear against the wall, listening for the animals in the barn. The way Esther's face was a mask of calm leadership, even though he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind finally lessened to a low moan, but then they heard a new sound. A terrible groaning crack from the direction of the barn. It was followed by a splintering crash that they heard even over the wind. Isaac's blood ran cold. "The roof," he whispered. He grabbed his heaviest coat. "You can't go out there," Esther cried, grabbing his arm. "You'll be lost in seconds." "The animals," he said, his face a grim mask. "If the roof collapsed, they'll be crushed or freeze." The livestock was their entire future. Without them, they wouldn't survive. "Then we all go," Matilda said, her voice solid as rock. She was already pulling on her wraps. "You can't do it alone." It was suicide, but looking at their determined faces, Isaac knew he couldn't stop them. He found a coil of rope. "We tie ourselves together," he commanded. "No one lets go." He tied the rope around his waist, then Esther's, then Matilda's, then Beatrice's. A human chain against the storm. Opening the door was like opening the gate to hell. A wall of snow and wind slammed into them. Isaac lowered his head and plunged into the white chaos, the others stumbling behind him. The 30 feet to the barn felt like a mile. The wind stole their breath. The snow blinded them. They were guided only by the rope and Isaac's memory. When they finally slammed against the barn wall, they were gasping, their faces numb. The scene inside was a nightmare. A huge section of the roof had collapsed under the snow's weight. Heavy beams and timbers lay in a tangled wreck. Snow and wind poured into the barn. His horse, Pate, was trapped, a heavy beam pinning him in his stall. The cow was bellowing in terror. For a second, Isaac felt true despair. It was over. But then Matilda moved past him, murmuring to the cow. Esther was already assessing the damage, her mind all sharp, practical angles. "We have to free the horse!" Isaac shouted. He grabbed an axe and started hacking at the smaller timbers around the main beam. Matilda joined him, using her brute strength to haul away debris. But it was Beatrice who saw the real danger. "Isaac, look!" she screamed, pointing up. A huge, splintered section of the remaining roof was groaning, swaying, ready to come down right on top of them. "Get back!" Isaac yelled, shoving Matilda. But there was no time. He put his shoulder to the massive beam pinning Pate, a desperate, hopeless effort. Suddenly Esther was there, jamming a smaller plank into a gap, trying to make a lever. Matilda threw her weight next to Isaac's. Even Beatrice, her fear gone, was there, pulling at smaller pieces of wood. They worked in a frantic, desperate unison. The roof above them gave a final, terrible groan. "Now!" Isaac roared. With one last, collective, superhuman heave, the beam moved. Just enough. Pate scrambled free, his leg bloody but not broken. Isaac grabbed Beatrice and Matilda and threw them toward the safer side of the barn, just as the rest of the roof came down with a deafening crash, burying the spot where they had just been standing in tons of snow and timber. They lay huddled in the semi-darkness, gasping for air, bruised and freezing, but alive. In the chaotic aftermath, Isaac looked at the three women who had just risked their lives with him. Their faces were smudged with dirt, pale with cold, but their eyes were shining with a fierce, brilliant light. And in that moment, in the heart of the wreckage, something inside Isaac finally shattered. It wasn't grief, it was love. A profound, overwhelming wave of it, so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. Not the ghost of his love for Mary. This was new. This was alive and roaring like the storm. He loved Esther for her unbreakable strength. He loved Matilda for her deep, quiet compassion. He loved Beatrice for her relentless spirit, her ability to create beauty in the middle of ruin. He loved all of them, not as a replacement for what he'd lost, but as the builders of what he had found. Henderson had sent him 3 women as a cruel joke. And in the heart of a Dakota blizzard, Isaac Prescott realized he had fallen in love with all of them. He had fallen in love with his family. But the storm had passed. Henderson's storm had not. And it was heading right for them. The blizzard broke, leaving behind a world that was silent, white, and beautiful. The farm was a wreck, but they were alive. And they were together. The work that followed was the hardest Isaac had ever known. From dawn till dusk, they shoveled snow, salvaged wood from the ruined barn, and built a temporary shelter for the animals. The storm had burned away the last of their caution with each other. They were a single unit, a family forged in crisis. Isaac would find himself just watching them, filled with a quiet sense of wonder. Esther, expertly splinting a broken timber. Matilda, calming the injured horse with her gentle touch. Beatrice, her previous fears conquered, diligently securing a canvas roof, her cheeks bright red from the cold. They weren't helpless women. They were pioneers. They were survivors. One evening, exhausted, they sat around the fire. The house was an island of warmth in the frozen dark. Isaac looked at them, his heart so full he felt it might burst. "Esther," he said, his voice quiet. She looked up. "When you arrived," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I thought my life was over. This house was a grave. I was a ghost." He looked her straight in the eye. "You and your sisters, you brought me back to life. What that man Henderson meant as a curse has been the single greatest gift I have ever received." Tears welled in Esther's eyes. "We were just trying to survive, Isaac," she whispered, "same as you." "No," he said, shaking his head. "It was more than that. In the storm, I realized I love you, all of you, not like a man loves a bride, but like a man loves his family. You are my home now." A tear rolled down Esther's cheek. She reached out and put her hand on his. "We love you too, Isaac," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave us a home when we had none. You gave us respect when we had only ever known ridicule. You are our family." And then she told him the secret. She told him why they had really come. It wasn't just about finding a husband, it was about escape. Back east, after their parents died, they were left in the care of an uncle, a cruel man who saw them not as nieces, but as assets, burdens to be sold off. He'd arranged a marriage for Esther to a man twice her age, a violent drunk who had already buried 2 wives. When she refused, the uncle had locked her up, planning to force her. The mail-order bride advertisement had been their last, desperate gamble. They had pooled what little money they had for one train ticket, for one sister to get away and maybe, somehow, find a way to send for the others. But on the day the train was to leave, their uncle had found out. There was a terrible fight. They had managed to escape, all 3 of them, with only what they could carry, and ran for the station. They had boarded the train with no plan, no money, and no destination except away. They knew the ad was for one woman. They just prayed that whoever was on the other end would have a shred of mercy. Isaac listened, a cold, hard anger building in his gut. The cruelty of Henderson seemed like a child's prank compared to the darkness these women had escaped. It explained everything. Their fierce loyalty to each other, their resilience, their deep-seated dignity. They weren't just survivors, they were warriors. Spring finally came, and with it, a sense of new beginnings. They rebuilt the barn, stronger than before, their shared laughter echoing in the clear air. The farm began to thrive. But Henderson hadn't forgotten his humiliation. He couldn't stand seeing the family he tried to destroy actually succeed. He saw their prosperity as a personal insult. He was a man who needed to have the last laugh. One night, a strange orange glow flickered against the windows. Isaac bolted upright. The new barn. It was on fire. He and the sisters rushed out, but it was too late. The fire was already consuming the new structure, the product of all their back-breaking work. They managed to get the animals out just in time, but the barn was a total loss. Staring at the smoldering ruins, Isaac felt a cold, familiar despair. But Esther's voice cut through it. "He won't beat us, Isaac." It wasn't a fire from a stray spark. It was arson. And they all knew who was responsible. But they had no proof. The town sheriff was in Henderson's pocket. They were on their own. They started to rebuild again. But this time, they were watching. They took turns standing guard at night. A few days later, Matilda was on watch when she saw it. A figure, moving stealthily in the dark near the corral, trying to spook the livestock, to cause a stampede that would destroy their fences and scatter their animals across the prairie. But Matilda wasn't the timid woman who had stepped off the train. She was a daughter of the prairie now. She didn't scream. She moved silently, circling around. She found a length of rope they'd been using for the fence posts. While the man was fumbling with the gate latch, she expertly threw a loop over him, pulling it tight and bringing him crashing to the ground. Isaac and the others came running at the noise. When they rolled the man over, they saw his face in the moonlight. It wasn't Henderson. It was one of his store clerks, a young man known for being weak-willed and desperate for Henderson's approval. He confessed everything. Henderson had paid him to set the fire, and then to cause the stampede. He was promised a promotion, a permanent job. He was terrified. "He said you were a joke," the young man whimpered. "He said you all needed to be taught a lesson." Isaac didn't hit him. He looked at the sniveling man, and then at the sisters standing beside him, strong and unbroken. "The lesson," Isaac said, his voice cold and clear, "is about to be taught." The next morning, Isaac and the 3 sisters hitched up the wagon. They tied up the clerk and threw him in the back, and they drove into Providence. They didn't stop at the sheriff's office. They stopped right in front of Henderson's mercantile, right as the whole town was out for their morning business. Isaac dragged the clerk out of the wagon and threw him onto the dusty street. "This man," Isaac announced, his voice booming across the square, "works for Walter Henderson, and last night, on Henderson's orders, he burned down my barn and tried to destroy my livestock." A gasp went through the crowd. Henderson came storming out of his store, his face purple with rage. "This is slander! Lies!" "Is it?" Esther said, her voice cutting through the air. She held up a small, distinctive silver flask. "He dropped this when he fell. I believe it has your initials on it, Mr. Henderson." Henderson's face went white. He looked from the flask to the terrified clerk, to the silent, watching faces of the townspeople. They weren't whispering about Isaac anymore. They were staring at him. Their looks of pity for the lonely farmer had been replaced by a grudging respect, and their casual amusement at Henderson's joke had curdled into disgust. He had gone too far. This wasn't a prank. This was a crime. Henderson was ruined. The sheriff had no choice but to arrest him. No one in town would trade with him again. His reign of petty tyranny was over. They drove back to the farm, not in silence, but with a quiet sense of victory. They had faced down cruelty, nature, and pure malice, and they had won. Standing on the porch that evening, Isaac looked out at his land. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of life, full of promise. He could hear the sisters inside, their voices and laughter filling the house. This wasn't the life he had ever imagined. It was something harder, stranger, and 1,000,000 times better. He had been sent 3 sisters as the cruelest joke imaginable, and in them he had found everything he had ever lost, and so much more he never knew he was looking for. He had found a family. He had found a purpose. He had found a home. If you enjoyed this story of justice and unexpected family, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories you won't want to miss.